is that if we're talking the squeezed middle, it drew me towards what I would think of this budget as a tummy tuck budget. Your life becomes a little bit less joyful, a bit more miserable with the quantities and types of food you can have, the drink you can have, the cocktails you can't have. And eventually, that weight in terms of the things you've cut starts to come on back for many people.
Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Newsroom political editor Laura Walters, and with me today in Wellington is Marc Dalder.
Hello.
And joining us from Auckland is Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. So today it's the big budget breakdown. We will be talking about tax cuts, of course. We'll have a go at naming the budget, which is maybe trickier than you might think. Look at what was missing and maybe peer over the edge of some fiscal cliffs. And to wrap it all up, we will be offering you some recommendations. Tim, you will be happy to know that we are no longer counting down sleeps to budget day. It has happened. And we all slept very well last night after a hard day's work down in the gallery here. So, of course, the centrepiece of the budget was tax. Yesterday, specifically, tax cuts in the form of income tax bracket adjustments, tax credits, and the government's foreshadowed family boost policy. Now, Marc, there's a lot to kind of unpack here and pick through. What will people get from these cuts, and how do they compare with what National campaigned on?
Yeah, the final cut package is very similar to what National did campaign on in the end. There's a particular change in there was a plan to adjust the abatement threshold for working for families. He says, hoping people don't fall asleep, in 2026, which isn't going to happen anymore. But we knew that from the end of the coalition negotiations. That came out of that. So other than that, it's very, very closely aligned. The brackets follow the same pattern as what was laid out in National's plan. It means that they say the average working age New Zealander will get about $16 a week or $32 a fortnight, depending on how you count your money, count your tax cuts. For the average household with children, it's $39 a week, and the sort of maximum amount, that sort of $250 a week that the National had kind of highlighted as people getting up to, that will be available for around 3,000 people. Maybe a little under 3,000 people, it sounds like.
Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit more, Marc. That $250 figure that you mentioned, that's what everyone was focusing on ahead of the budget. And it's been incredibly confusing, and it seems like Nicola Willis actually caused some confusion herself yesterday. We're not sure exactly how many people will be eligible for that. Ahead of the budget, they made it sound like it was going to be 3,000 people, maybe more. We spoke about this last week on Raw Politics. The Council of Trade Unions said it might only just be 3,000. Yesterday's budget, Nicola Willis said it will be more, and then she had to correct herself. I mean, what's she done here? She's caused a lot of confusion, hasn't she, Tim? I'm
not sure if it's her or the Prime Minister and her, but basically it's a real example of over-promising and under-delivering on this thing. So even though the Council of Trade Unions last year had estimated it would be 3,000 max, it very much was max. She had to correct herself in the budget, pre-budget lockup, to say, well, actually, I've got that wrong. It's up to 3,000. So the up twos are creeping around, What it all sort of comes back to is that in opposition, you've got to be careful in what you promise. Chris Bishop, her assistant in finance and her co-writer on all these things, has the view that was then and this is now, and dismisses journalists and political opponents going back, trawling previous statements and promises and saying, well, we don't care. That's what we're doing. This is it. Overall, I think these tax cuts, adjustments as they are, probably do appeal to people. She said there'd be meaningful tax cuts. I don't think they're that meaningful at $30 a fortnight, $16 a week, whatever it was, Marc. But they're not meaningless. You say to someone, I'm going to give you $16 a week, $30 a fortnight, round it all up, and if they wanted to play their game with rounding up the number of years money is given for, they could even say it's $6,000 over the 4-year period. You start to get a number that's okay. if you're going to give it to me, fine. I don't know how much it moves it politically for them, but they have provided numbers that aren't, the classic chewing gum thing that has got very cliched now. It's beyond that, apart from, of course, the superannuitants.
Yeah. That raises the question of who these tax cuts are for, right? And they talked about kind of the squeezed middle a lot. I mean, I would say it's the squeezed upper middle. Well, it feels a little bit more like to me. And as you raise as superannuitants, and some people aren't going to be very well off at all. I mean, maybe more than chewing gum, but couldn't buy a coffee with it each.
And many superannuitants will consider themselves squeezed. Absolutely. It's not as if they're sort of all on the fat of the lamb with their freehold houses and, taking trips and things. This is part of the constituency. It rises, I think, Marc, in year 2 and 3, that amount that the superannuitants get. So the $2.15 a week each, which might buy you a Bic pen for your crossword, might buy you a part of a ball of wool for your knitting. That's so tiny, but it does rise, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it rises because superannuation payments rise, and as a result of that, you get more than you would have otherwise of that payment. You get taxed on it slightly less. But that's also the only group that will kind of see that kind of effect of it continuing to flow through in future years, which is interesting. Like with that example of the working age New Zealander, the $16 a week, if they earn $800 a week post-tax, which is not a high wage by any means. That $16 a week is 2% of their post-tax income they get back. Inflation should be at 2%. It's higher now, but even if it was, that means next year that's been eaten up already. And there's no proposal or serious consideration, I think, from the government that they're going to be doing another round of tax cuts next year.
I think Nicola Willis actually said no. She was quite clear yesterday. This is all we can afford for until we return to surplus. And we're talking about how much people are getting, and whether it's a little bit and it still helps, or whether it's a bit more and it helps. But there are some people that are going to be worse off because of these tax cuts as well. Isn't that right, Marc?
Yeah, Thomas Coughlin in the Herald, a Newsroom alum, has written a piece looking at, there was this line in some of the Treasury documents released alongside the budget saying they thought for around 200 people, the interactions of these different tax credits and benefits as well would mean that they'd actually be $8 a week worse off, and the government was trying to look at how to, stop that from happening, basically help these people out so that it is still a net positive for everyone. But Thomas Coughlin has reported that number is actually more around 9,000 people now. So you've got less than 3,000 getting that $250 a fortnight that was so heavily campaigned on, and 9,000 people are going to find themselves worse off unless the government can find a way to kind of tweak that or fix that kind of loophole.
Yeah, so Nicola Willis will be wanting to get that fixed, quick, smart, I would say. And I just wanted to pick up on your point earlier, Tim, about how these will be received. I feel like it's been a running theme in this season of Raw Politics that we've been talking about. When do the good times finally arrive? And we were waiting for Budget Day. And Nicola Willis did deliver exactly what she promised. I don't know why they let all of this, speculation and mystery swirl around it. She delivered essentially the tax cuts that she promised. And I expected there to be a really good response, immediate response from people from that kind of middle New Zealand, that squeezed middle. And I will say that I do exist in a bit of a Beltway bubble here, but I was, watching the people on the news that had been, the Vox Pops on the news. I was having a look around on different social media platforms. I was talking to my family who do live in the regions, and I was really struggling to find people that were excited about it. So maybe we're still waiting until that July 31, deadline hits. People actually see the money in their bank account. Maybe that's when they feel differently about this, but I don't think that's really come yet. We're still waiting for those good times.
And July is going to be a big month for this because up here in Auckland, the regional fuel tax expires on July 1. So you'll see that 12.5 cents or whatever it works out to be per litre going. So there's a bit of a gain, and then at the end of the month, you'll get whatever you're getting, or for those 9,000 people, whatever you're paying or not getting. And for the superannuitants, they'll get their little bit as well. July will be a month for this government to start being able to say they've done something on CPI and the cost of living problem.
Well, we've spoken a lot about tax, and that was obviously the centrepiece of this budget, but there's also been a lot of discussion around debt and deficits. It seems like Nicola Willis wanted to go further, do more there, that probably she's not very happy with the levels of debt that this government is holding on to. Can you explain a little bit more about that broader picture?
Yeah, I think largely due to the weakening economic situation, you have less tax revenue coming in to the government's coffers, but the government's still, having a decent budget allowance of $3.2 billion and some operating allowances going forward. Those are slimmer, but they are, still increasing the money the government spends. And that just means debt is going to be remaining above 40% of GDP for quite a while, out through the whole forecast period, out to 2028, still above that 40% marker, which is the top of the 20 to 40% range that Nicola Willis says she wants to be in. But in the context of the tax cuts, Nicola Willis had a choice here. She could have gone really hard on the deficit. She could have listened to the sort of right-leaning economists like Michael Riddell, who were saying, this is not a time for tax cuts specifically because of the spending of the previous government and the deficit situation we find ourselves in. And so Nicola Willis will say these tax cuts are fully funded, but that's using the wrong counterfactual. They're fully funded, but all the things that were cut to pay for them are things the government would have done anyways. Do we really believe they would have just kept Lake Onslow if not for the tax cuts? I don't. And so then the counterfactual actually is they do these cuts and they put that money into something else, maybe frontline services, but they've done a decent investment in frontline services in the budget, so more likely paying down that debt. In the end, the decision for Nicola Willis, that the point where she could make a choice is, do I want to use this cash for tax cuts or do I want to use it to pay down debt? And she chose tax cuts. It's hard for her to kind of cry foul now that deficit has been pushed out another year, that return to surplus has been pushed out another year, and that debt is going to be higher for longer.
Mm-hmm. And you asked her that question specifically yesterday in the budget lockup, and her response to you was something along the lines of, yes, I could have chosen to break my promise to New Zealanders, and I chose not to. So it's a political choice.
It's the politics over the economic and fiscal picture, which is fine. That's what governments tend to do. But it's hard to then come and say we're going to be the responsible fiscal managers making the unpopular decisions when they aren't.
Now, it has been a tradition for at least a few years for the government to name its budget, give it a bit of a subtitle, if you will, while the opposition finds some, pejorative label to attach. Nicola Willis has kind of ditched this tradition. She's going with her basic budget, essentially. There were no frills, there were no glossy pictures, nothing like that on her budget document. There have been a lot of names thrown around in the past kind of 24 hours. I'm really interested to hear from both of you what you would like to name this budget. Tim, shall we start with you?
Well, I see that she got drawn out eventually and was happy to call hers the Goldilocks budget because it was not too much and not too little, which is one of those very sort of middling, guarded views on things. Look, I don't have one. I think that the best sort of names that attach to budgets come out of some fiery moment of debate when someone comes out with something that just really just latches on. I think one thematic thing that struck me is that if we're talking the squeezed middle, it drew me towards what I would think of this budget as a tummy tuck budget. It's a form of bariatric surgery where they forcibly restrain your capacity to spend, not eat. But your life becomes a little bit less joyful, a bit more miserable with the quantities and types of food you can have, the drink you can have, the cocktails you can't have. And eventually, that weight in terms of the things you've cut starts to come on back for many people.
Okay, the tummy tuck budget from Tim, I like it. I haven't heard it before. It's unique. What have you got for us, Marc?
I've got the power couple budget because it feels to me like that's the people who actually win the most out of this budget is the professional couple, with kids, both of them working, so their kids are in daycare. They get that family boost tax credit thing. They get to be one of the lucky 3,000 who get to say we get our $250 a fortnight, and maybe it actually does make a difference for us.
Great. Mine's a little bit more boring, probably in keeping with the theme of this budget. I'm calling it the home brand budget, I think. So, people might be able to buy a little bit more. Maybe at the supermarket, their dollar will go a little bit further, but it's to your point about no cocktails, Tim, it's not the flashy brands. It's just going to be some more bread, some more milk, some more home brand cereal for most people, I would think. There is a decent amount in this budget, but one of the most notable bits is what is missing. Specifically, National's promise to fund 13 new cancer drugs by the end of this year has not been lived up to. That can has been kicked down the road. Then there were a few coalition agreement commitments that haven't got funding yet either, enough that the Treasury has labelled them a specific fiscal risk. Marc, let's start with you. How big of a deal is it that those cancer drugs are missing? Is that a broken promise?
Yeah, I think it sounds like a broken promise. It's unfortunate for the government, right? Because it's a pretty solid negative headline to have attached to this budget, that there was such a high expectation. There are so many people who, the government will have got good press out of and good votes out of for making this promise, who now are going to give it the same amount of press, but in reverse, in terms of, those really hard negative criticisms. You already saw in the news people paying $5,000 a month for their cancer drugs. They were promised by National that these would be funded, and they aren't, right? So maybe with a normal budget, you end up with some things that are fine and some things that are good. You don't usually end up with quite like a serious negative headline like this, but it is a big minus, a big con for the government, and it's quite a big deal, obviously, for the people who are counting on that funding as well.
Absolutely, and at the same time, we've got the reintroduction of the prescription co-payment for a lot of people as well. So,
That's right.
So just keep holding both those things in your head. I mean, what were the obvious gaps for you, Tim? Anything jump out?
Probably two or three things, Laura. The cancer one is devastating, actually, politically. I don't know that I've seen a headline and a press release from probably a well-regarded organisation, not a partisan political organisation, as bad for a budget or a government as this. And the Cancer Society's headline was "Budget Fails Those Living with Cancer," and said that those who had been promised this last year will be crushed by it. And when you think about it, many of those people won't maybe be around in year 2 or 3 or 4, whenever that might be, that the funding for these drugs comes about. So it's very poor politics. I know they're arguing, Shane Retty saying we're waiting to get the money from the $5 prescription charge, coming back on, that'll fund this. But that, again, wasn't so clear at election time last year, and it's that over-promising and under-delivering thing again. The other thing that troubled me about the budget really was the existence of these fiscal cliffs, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later on as well, but particularly of all organisations, for this government and law and order matters, to have supplied the police with $120 million, which will expire after this year. So next year, they must find $120 million in savings that they couldn't find this year, that they just couldn't come up with. And they convinced ministers, if you put that sort of cut on us, it's going to affect policing and safety and what we do. So how that happens in less than 12 months from now, who knows? So I think that's a big gap, a big flaw politically again. That is a raw point here out of this budget.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, and this has been mentioned by many people, but one of the things that I thought was missing or was a gap were programs and initiatives specifically for Māori and Pasifika people. I mean, they were mentioned a lot in the budget documents, but they were all in the wrong columns. They were all in the cuts. Ministry by ministry had cut Māori-specific programs and initiatives. It will be interesting when we, start to see the advice and, cabinet documents and things like that come out, whether there was any direction there to specifically go and look at those programs. Nicola Willis fielded quite a few questions around that yesterday, but it's in keeping with that feeling that debates around this government. Are they doing enough for Māori? And of course, Nicola Willis and others will say, well, we are, because we're putting money into, frontline health services, education services. That helps everyone, including Māori, but that line just isn't working for this section of the population, and we saw that yesterday with the demonstrations around the country. They were obviously timed for Budget Day, but it was broader than that. This budget was just one more thing where Māori said, this government is not delivering for us. And actually, I think that those, call it a strike or a protest or whatever you will, but those demonstrations were pretty big yesterday, and maybe bigger than some people would expect, and shows the strength of feeling out there. So the government will have to be watching that space, I think. One other thing that Nicola Willis did proactively raise during yesterday's budget was the possibility of a flat tax. What's that all about, Marc?
Yeah, that was in the ACT National Coalition Agreement to have a look at a flat tax, and it sounds like they did. I don't think it's something that ever would have actually happened, right? But it wasn't just window dressing in terms of claiming that they looked at it. Seymour seems to feel like he had a good hearing with Nicola Willis. He said, he disagreed with her saying it wasn't possible. He said we could have done it, but it would have required cutting public spending to a degree that National and New Zealand First weren't willing to do, and or required debt funding the tax cuts, which ACT wasn't willing to do. And so that's kind of where he put that down. He said it's possible, they didn't have the guts to do it. And to some extent, I think National and New Zealand First will enjoy that, right? Because, yes, they campaigned on cuts, but they didn't campaign on, like, the cruelty and the brutality of some of the stuff that we've seen coming out, right? So if they've got David Seymour saying, you didn't cut enough, that helps National and New Zealand First, and it helps ACT because it shows that ACT voters, actually they still have that advocacy going for further cuts. And it sounds like that may happen in future budgets as well.
Mm-hmm. And to your point there about the level of the cuts as well, it's going to be something to keep an eye on, not just in these, days and potentially weeks to come as we pick through those initiatives. Of course, we'll start to understand a little bit more about what's been lost in these cuts, but these things take months, if not years, to kind of see the flow-on effects. So that's going to be something that we'll have to watch and see whether these cuts were true, back office, things that didn't matter, things that weren't needed, or whether maybe some of this is going to have a very real impact on Kiwis' lives as well.
And that's the thing with instant punditry on the budget by everybody, including our podcast right now, is that in some ways these things take a long time to get a real fix on. Even the opposition politicians don't see some aspects. Some of the lobby groups don't understand and see it. Some things turn out better, some things worse. But, in many ways, looking at a budget straight away is a bit like, was it Chow and Lai, when he was asked about, his view of the impact of the French Revolution in 1972, and he said it was too early to tell. So, you've got to just step back a bit, and we will see, and it might be advantageous to this coalition government in some ways. It might not, but they've left themselves some real sleepers with, for example, that police fiscal cliff, and Marc, as you pointed out in your writing, the operating balance for the next 3 years being so lower than just sort of keeping things ticking over. So 100 million at least lower than what they need, according to the Treasury, to keep things ticking over. So already in a year's time, they face challenges that mean that what we're going through now won't be the end of it.
Tim, just out of curiosity, for this budget, before we can give a good, well-reckoned, well-informed kind of analysis, how many sleeps would it take before we got there?
Well, it'll be hundreds of sleeps, Marc.
Okay, thank you.
Don't say that, Tim. He'll be counting them all down. So our audience question this week is, Nicola Willis railed against fiscal cliffs left to her by Labour. So are there any in her budget? Now, Tim, you have already spoken about that fiscal cliff with the cost pressures for police. Obviously, that one really jumped out, stuck out like a sore thumb there. But there are others as well. I asked a good friend and economist Brad Olson to help me go through all of the pages that had time-limited funding tables on them and find the ones that could actually be considered, fiscal cliffs. And we managed to count 8 of them that weren't things that were either ongoing or were obviously going to wrap up at the end of a review or a program that was always, going to be time limited. Things other than the police one was things like the school lunches program, which we've already spoken about. This government said Labor left us a fiscal cliff with not funding the school lunches program. They've gone and done the same thing, just funded it for 2 years and no more. There's also things like the extension of the screen grants, the filmmakers, rebate there. That's funded out, but only for another budget or so, and then that stops. So there are a few other fiscal cliffs there. Of course, it's difficult because they're going to have to either do a lot of cutting like we've been talking about, or they are just going to have to find the money in out years. As Brad put it, this is fiscal purgatory for these things. But it's also incredibly hypocritical, isn't it, Tim?
Well, it is. That's the thing of it, really, in that, of course, there is time-limited funding in every government's budget forever. If you're putting on the Rugby World Cup in 3 years' time, you're going to have funding for 3 years. Those sorts of things are defined as time limited. But this government came in and sort of feigned shock and surprise at this budgetary process, and that as if this had not been the case in previous national-led times, or in the Labor-led government that Winston Peters, New Zealand First, was part of for 3 years, just 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago. So it was just a sort of a political ploy to paint the other guys very badly. And of course, it's always going to rebound on you when you find you have to do it as well. So again, pretty cheap politics, and it has a pretty cheap sort of rebound.
I wondered a little bit whether it's kind of virtue signalling as well. Look, these are the things that we are being forced to fund, but we would prefer not to. We'll put them here and essentially say to departments, don't you dare bake in that spending for out years. You need to try and find a way to do it differently because we don't agree with these programs, but our hand has been forced this budget. They tried to find an excuse as well, didn't they, Marc, or kind of an explanation around that time-limited funding in this small print at the bottom.
Yeah, they said that most of these things were, subject to review, and that's why. One example, there was a small amount of money, a few $100,000 for trialing a delivery unit within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Don't know exactly what that will be or how it differs from Grant Robertson's implementation unit, which was, of course, widely mocked by National at the time. So, again, maybe another case of hypocrisy. I did like the line from Brad Olson about fiscal purgatory, and one of the reasons why was just, it highlights the effect it actually has on the people working on those policies and programs. I think everyone in the public sector is on notice now that, whatever you're doing, it could come up for review and could be cut in future budgets for those reasons we've talked about. But if you've specifically got that time-limited funding, if you're dangling over that fiscal cliff, it's much more apparent. And it also just becomes harder to do things like hire staff for those programs, because who's going to come on if they have no idea if the program's going to be funded in 8 months? To do long-term planning when you don't know if there is a long-term future. If it isn't strictly needed to be time-limited, there's a reason that we think these fiscal cliffs are bad, and that applies regardless of the colour of the government.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you watched, read, or listened to this week that you enjoyed. I'm going to go first, if you guys don't mind. I'm going to recommend Joel MacManus's sketch from the budget debate in the House yesterday. It's called Giant Hands in Jamaican Reggae. The budget debate goes off the rails. If anyone ever wondered how large Simon Watt's hands are, this is the piece for you. It was very funny. It might have been because I was, sleep deprived and delirious, but I had a very good laugh at this piece, so I would recommend it. Marc, what have you got?
Yeah, I've got a bit more loyalty to Newsroom, so I'm going to recommend Tim Murphy's sketch from the budget debate in the House, which was also very hilarious. It doesn't provide important information like the size of Simon Watt's hands, so that's obviously an oversight, but between the two, you should probably have a pretty good sense of what happened in the House on Thursday.
Oh. And how about you, Tim?
Mine is a read, and it's Tova O'Brien in stuff from out of the budget lockup, and her story on the correction that Nicola Willis was forced to make to her budget in discussion, and that was over those who gets the $250 extra, and she had sort of committed it in that lockup to $3,000, had to go backwards from that with a little note handed through to Tova as she wrote. So good work, and yeah, got to a raw point.
Just one thing I want to say that I don't recommend, which was the food in the budget lockup. Sushi, very woke, really inhibited my writing.
That's it from Raw Politics this week. Thank you to our producer, Hugo Stewart, and our readers, listeners, and viewers. Please send any burning questions you have to me, Laura Walters, at laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us next week here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.